Thanks for joining the Peak Performance Masterclass. I'm excited to be your host today. Thank you very much for dialing in. So today we're going to talk about peak performance, and in particular, we want to talk about flow state. I will share some stories about myself as well as about other people. And these stories will demonstrate the power of flow state and how it enables people to get to levels of performance they've never been before. So imagine this: achieving peak performance effortlessly, like a well-oiled machine, like Michael Jordan, like Shohei Ohtani, or like Beethoven, or Richard Branson, or Jeff Bezos. They've been there. And today we're going to talk about how you could get there as well. But what if I told you that you could raise your game to a level of performance you've never been before? Now let me ask you this: if you reach that level, if you'd get to the very edge of your capabilities, what would become possible for you? Think about it. If you want to, close your eyes and visualize it. And ask yourself, if you would achieve this, what other things could come your way? Things like praise, payment, promotion, self-satisfaction, I don't know, love, self-respect. If you reach that level of performance, and what emotions come up when you see this in front of you? And how would you feel then? Now, what if I told you that this is very much possible for you? That you could raise your game to levels you've never been to before? Because that's exactly what we're going to talk about over the next hour. And hopefully at some point, we can use the PowerPoint as well. But until then, we'll do it without. But good that we're on this slide, because basically over the next hour, we're going to talk about 5 things. The first pillar is going to be the science of flow. What flow is and why it is key to peak performance. Then we're going to talk about how you get into flow. Then we're going to talk about flow management. Once these 3 building blocks are in place, I'll present the flow mastery framework, which is a 5-step plan how to maximize flow and performance in your life and your career, as well as how the peak performance program enables you to go through these steps on a consistent basis, enabling you to find more flow, perform better, and experience more life satisfaction. And finally, I will come with a New Year's gift. And I'm convinced that what I will share to you could truly transform your life and your career, because that's what happened to me. So I want to start this masterclass with a story about my experience with flow and peak performance, and how this eventually even triggered me to make the transition from the financial services industry into coaching. And for this story, I want to take you back to the second half of 2009. Because these were my first 6 months at Citigroup. So I started at Citi in August of 2009 as a European equity sales. My job was to advise Dutch institutional investors on how to invest in European equities. I based this advice on the analysis and recommendation coming out of our research department. And the quality of the recommendation and the advice determined where you would rank against your competitors. And the rank determined how much you would get paid by the institution for that advice. So I was excited about this opportunity. I was the main man selling European equities into Dutch investors. And this was a big step up. Before that, I worked at Morgan Stanley, where I was the number 3. I was basically the junior at the desk and was made redundant because the market was so difficult. I did realize that I had to fight a steep uphill battle. I had 4 main disadvantages versus my competitors. Competitors like Morgan Stanley, JP Morgan, Merrill Lynch, UBS, because all of those competitors had more salespeople covering Dutch accounts. They had more experience than I had. They had better relationships and had a better research product to sell. But I didn't care. I wanted this job. I felt I had nothing to lose. And I went all in. Now, investing back in 2009 was pretty difficult. You could basically argue that it was more difficult than at any other point in the cycle. Our investment strategist, Rob Buckland, called this time the twilight zone, which basically meant that all conventional wisdom about investing went out of the window as it didn't work. And because all conventional wisdom went out of the window, it was very hard to invest. And the Dutch investors struggled, and they could really use some solid advice on how to navigate these difficult market circumstances. So over my first few weeks at Citi, I spent a lot of time with their research analysts to get to know them and to get to know their research. And throughout these meetings, I started to connect the dots. I started to get a picture of how the Dutch investors could navigate these difficult markets. I saw more and more patterns, and the picture became clearer and clearer in my head. And at one point in September, somewhere in the afternoon, I decided to sit down and type an email. And I called this email PM Dilemma. And as I started to type, everything fell into place. The words came easily, effortlessly. I felt as if I became one with the activity, and my sense of self disappeared, and I wasn't aware of my own body anymore. When I finished the email, I looked up, and I saw I was the only one left. Everybody else had gone home. I looked at the clock, and I saw 4 hours had gone by, but it only felt like 15 minutes. And I felt absolutely amazing as I realized I just created a masterpiece. I went home and I sent out the email the next day, and that email changed everything. I was no longer a junior sales who clients could ignore. I had something interesting and useful to say, and I could help them out. A few days later, it was time for part 2. And again, same story. Deep flow state and another masterpiece. I was really surprised by what I had produced, as I didn't realize I was capable of coming up with something like this. I ran the PM Dilemma series until the end of the year. And at the end of 2009, the clients had to review all the banks for their advice and the quality of their advice and the research. And it appeared that I'd won the uphill battle, as I beat all of my competitors. Out of the 4 most important teams in the Netherlands, Citi was ranked number 1 with 3 of them and number 2 with the rest. Now, my boss asked me how on earth I pulled this off. I gave him somewhat of a bullshit answer, simply because I didn't know. And because I didn't know, I wasn't ever able to repeat it again. In fact, I didn't even come close. But something changed in the middle of 2017, i.e. almost 8 years later. I just read a book by Steve Kotler about the flow state. And I had to do a presentation on investment ideas to the global team of a client based in Mayfair. And I did this together with my colleague, Neil. We went through the slides and everything went pretty smoothly, when suddenly the most senior PM in the room, he threw us a curveball. He said that he didn't want to talk about new investment ideas anymore, but he wanted to talk about the oil and gas industry. We weren't prepared for that. And Neil was totally caught off guard, and he froze into his chair. But somehow I was able to rise to the challenge and really give a good performance. And as we walked out, Neil couldn't contain his excitement, and I was still groggy by the flow state that I was in. We nailed it. And I realized that this must have been flow. And also that flow was helped me back in 2009. So then and there, my fascination with flow state began, and I decided to delve deeper into this topic. So I started to read books, I started to look at TED Talks, and eventually it even triggered me to leave the financial services industry and pursue a career in coaching. I did an extensive coaching course at the prestigious Flow Research Collective about peak performance and flow coaching. And now I've got both the knowledge and experience about peak performance and flow. Knowledge from the books and courses, experience from my careers in both sports and business. And since making the transition, I helped dozens of clients raise their games and achieve career milestones. So with that, let me dive into the 3 pillars of the masterclass. The first one being the science of flow and how it connects to peak performance. Let me see if I can get this to work again. That would be nice. So flow and peak performance. In this part, we'll go over a few things. So first, the link between peak performance and flow, then what flow is, and the neuroanatomy of flow, the neurochemistry of flow, and then the impact of flow. And I want to explain the story. I want to explain the link between peak performance and flow by telling the story of Steven Kotler, who you see here. Now, back in the 1990s, Steven was an action and adventure sports journalist. He chased extreme athletes across oceans and around mountains. But when you're not an extreme athlete yourself and you chase those people, you tend to break things. And Steven broke a lot of things, each time forcing him to take time off. And every time after had been out for 3 to 5 months, he saw that progress was astounding. Things that seemed impossible 3 months prior now was done on a regular basis. And to protect himself, he eventually left the action and adventure sport and started to investigate ultimate human performance. And there were 2 questions that he wanted to get answers. The first one is, what does it take to do the impossible? And the second, what does it take to level up your game to never before? So he also looked beyond action and adventure sports. He looked in domains like technology, innovation, entrepreneurship, business tycoons, and artists. But it didn't matter in which domain he looked, because in every domain he found that ultimate human performance had the exact same signature. And this signature was a state of consciousness called flow state. And he found that every major breakthrough, every gold medal, or every world record had flow state at the heart. So if you want to maximize your performance, you have to maximize flow. So he started to investigate what is flow. And in his quest, the first research that he bumped into, the first professor he bumped into, was this man, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. You could basically say that Mihai Csikszentmihalyi is the godfather of flow. He was professor at the University of Chicago, psychology professor, and he's also the co-founder of positive psychology together with Martin Seligman. Now, he was at some point was trying to answer the question, what contributes to a good life? And what he found is that people feel their best when in a particular state of consciousness. And the more time they spend in this state of consciousness, the more life satisfaction they experience. And people get into this state when they're engaged in an activity they enjoy and where the challenge of this activity is at the very edge of their skill set. So basically, challenged in an activity you enjoy. And when they did this, they got into this state. They were so locked in that everything else just seemed to disappear, including your sense of self and sense of time. The flow state felt flowy, and that's also why he called it flow. And even though, and what's very important here, because it's so challenging, you need to have all your attention on the activity. You need to have all your attention on the task at hand in the present moment. And what he saw, that despite that this activity was very challenging, effort felt almost effortlessly, as flow enables you to get close to near perfect, high-speed decision making. And in flow, all aspects of performance go through the roof, both physical performance as well as mental and cognitive performance. But I'll come back to that in a little bit later. So the second scientist that Steven Kotler bumped into was a guy called Arne Dietrich. And Arne Dietrich, he came across the neuroanatomy of flow. That's what he discovered. Because he was a professor, or he still is a professor, at the American University in Beirut. He's a professor of cognitive neuroscience. And in 2003, he published a groundbreaking research on the neuroanatomy of flow, and he introduced the transient hyperfrontality theory. Now, before Dietrich's discovery, the general notion was that peak performance had to be the full brain on overdrive, that every part of the brain have to work together in maximum fashion, in optimal fashion. And Arne found but it was exactly the other way around. So what does transient hyperfrontality stand for? Transient means temporarily, hypo means less, and frontality means front part of the brain, i.e. what he found that in flow state, the prefrontal cortex temporarily gets deactivated. And to explain you, we need to talk about the brain, because the brain is a highly energy-intensive organ. Although it represents just 2% of the body weight, it consumes 20 to 25% of the body's energy. And when you're in flow, when you need to focus, you need all your attention on skill execution and in-the-moment decision-making. And these all reside in the limbic part of the brain, which is sort of the middle part of the brain. And at that point, what you don't need are things like long-term planning or very complex decision-making. So in flow, an energy exchange takes place. And all of the energy goes to the limbic brain, and the prefrontal cortex actually gets shut down. And this has some profound impact. The first one has to do with time. So if you look at your feeling for time, that is calculated throughout the whole brain. But when parts of the brain go offline, you can no longer connect the dots that you need to connect. So therefore, your feeling of time disappears. And therefore, when you're in flow, you can work for 4 hours, but it only feels like 15 minutes. Or it could be the other way around. Or you're, for example, you're in a car crash and it takes 1 minute, but it feels like 15 minutes. So your feeling of time just disappears. The second interesting thing is that there's a reset of your nervous system as stress chemicals get significantly reduced in your body. And how does this work? So basically, when you're in flow, you're fully focused on the here and now. But if you look at stress, stress either has to do with something you fear in the future or potential regret from the past. But in flow, you're in the here and now. So therefore, future, past don't exist. So there's no stress required. On the other hand, when there's too much stress, you can't get into flow, but I'll get to that in a minute. So stress chemicals. The third thing is your sense of self and your self of morality disappear. These also reside in the limbic brain. Also, your inner voice quiets down. When you're working on an activity, you've got this voice in your head telling you, you can't do this, this won't work, people won't buy this, who do you think you are? This voice comes from the prefrontal cortex, but this shuts down. So therefore the voice shuts down. Therefore it gets quiet. And as a result of that, you're no longer holding yourself back. And that leads to a massive spike in creativity. Now, apart from a change in neuroanatomy in flow, there's also a change in neurochemistry in flow, as there's an optimization of stress chemicals and a release of powerful pleasure chemicals. Now, there are two very important chemicals at work to get you into flow. And these are norepinephrine or noradrenaline and dopamine. Noradrenaline is a chemical. This is basically where it starts. It all starts with noradrenaline. It's a chemical that makes you alert. It gets you focused on the task or at the data, but it also makes you feel slightly agitated. But at some point, dopamine comes to the rescue, because dopamine is a reward chemical, and it helps you to do stuff. So at one point, noradrenaline and dopamine optimally work together, and that's how you drop into flow. And when you get into flow, then endorphins and anandamide and serotonin get released. But how does the dynamic exactly work? I'll talk a little bit later when we talk about the flow triggers. So what's the impact of the change in neuroanatomy and neurochemistry? Well, basically, it leads to a massive spike in performance, both physical performance as well as cognitive performance. If you look at physical performance, three things happen: increased strength, increased muscle reaction time, and deaden pain. Especially anandamide and endorphins, they deaden pain. So what does that mean? That means you're stronger, you're faster, and you can go on for longer. Can you imagine what a competitive advantage you would have in certain sports if you spend more and more time in flow? Stronger, faster, can go on for longer. On the cognitive side, there are also a few elements. And the first one is motivation. So the 5 chemicals that I mentioned are 5 of the best chemicals, pleasure chemicals that the body can produce. So flow is also a very much a natural high. And that's why we want to go on. That's why we want to go back to it. And also why scientists call it the source code of intrinsic motivation. Now, the second thing that happens is there's a spike in creativity. Research from the Flow Research Collective has shown that in flow, we're 400 to 700% more creative. And even better, that the creativity can outlast the flow state by 1 or 2 days. So the more flow you have in your life, the more creative you become. The third thing is learning. Basically, the more chemicals, the faster you learn. And research shows that learning rates can go up to approximately 5-fold when you're in flow state. So ask yourself, there's the 10,000 hour rule of Marcus Ericsson to go to mastery. If you train more in flow, this can be probably half. So mastery is much closer than you think. You don't need to 10,000 hours, you need less if you spend more and more time in flow. And the fourth element is productivity. Now, McKinsey did a 10-year study tracking executives, and they found that executives in flow are 5 times more productive than out of flow. So basically, they can go to work on Monday, spend the whole day in flow, and take the rest of the day off and be just as productive as their steady state peers. Or the other way around. Can you imagine what kind of competitive advantage you'd have if you spend more time in flow? How much better you would become? So with all this probably raises the question, what gets us into flow? That's what I want to cover next. But before I do that, let me ask you, what is until now that resonate the most? And if you want to, you can put it in the chat. Or if there are burning questions, you can ask them as well. And you can raise your digital hand. Hi, Adrian.
Hi, Bastian. How are you?
I'm very well. How are you?
I'm good. Yeah, just caught it in time on a tight schedule. What stands out to me is that the loss of the prefrontal you called
transient
it
hypofrontality.
Exactly. So that sort of, your sense of self, your worries, the ego.
Yeah.
The ego, that kind of looks out for all the dangers in life, disappears. And I kind of think of kids playing, kids are really good at getting into flow. I think that really stands out to me, obviously the science, the other stuff, but that aspect really stands out.
Yeah, great. So interesting you mentioned kids. Why can kids drop into flow more easily? If you look at the development of the brain, the prefrontal cortex only starts to develop when we go into adolescence, into puberty, and it grows until 25. So kids naturally, because basically transient hypofrontality, so no prefrontal cortex. Young kids don't have a prefrontal cortex yet, so naturally they can drop more into flow and actually try things and are more creative. So great, yeah, thanks for that. So I've got a few interesting questions here. Let me see. How long does it take to get into flow state, and how long can you stay in flow for? And is there any drawbacks of being in flow state or being in flow state too long? And these are fascinating questions. Let me answer them at the end, because when you look at these questions, they all have to do with the flow cycle. And let me tell about the flow cycle at the end, because these are very valid and very important questions. So thank you very much for them. Yeah, group flow and individual flow. So individual flow is a biological phenomenon. you can just measure it. You can look at sort of they look at brain activity, the brain waves. They look at which part of the brain are active. They can look at your hormones in your body. So it's something you can measure. Group flow isn't. For group flow, two things are important. One, everybody in the team needs to be in individual flow. And on top of that, there are 7 criteria for group flow and 4 characteristics. And these have to be met. So if as a team you want to get into group flow, you need 2 layers. First, you need to teach the people of the team what individual flow is. And the second thing is you need to create, with a team, you need to create an environment. You need to look at the 7 elements of group flow and how you can make sure they work together, how you can fire on all cylinders. And these 2 things go hand in hand. But yeah, group flow is a very powerful dynamic. Yeah, get the criteria in order, and then flow will come. But more than happy to talk offline on group flow. So let's move on to the next pillar, and that is how we get into flow. And then here I want to talk about 2 things. I want to talk flow profile, and I want to talk about flow triggers. So there are ways to get into flow, and these are called flow triggers. And flow triggers are basically preconditions that help us drop into flow. Science has so far identified 22 of them. Half of them are individual triggers, and half of them are group triggers. Now, if you join a group coaching course or a one-on-one program, we can go through all of them and see which one are relevant for you and how to use them. But I'm going to focus on 4 here, just so you get a picture of the dynamics of flow triggers and how they work. And start with the first one, and that is the challenge skills balance, also called the golden rule for flow. And this is also the first thing that Mihai found. Because what he found is that people drop into flow when they're engaged in an activity where you need your full skill set to meet the challenge. It's at the point where you stretch but not snap. Now, if your skill set is high and the challenge is low, you don't really need to fully lean in. You can also multitask and do other stuff, and you can still accomplish it. So there's no need to be fully present in the here and now. And as a consequence, you won't drop into flow. At the same time, when the challenge is too high for your skill set, anxiety gets triggered. And anxiety gets triggered, you get too much stress chemicals in your body. You worry about the consequences, so you worry about the then and there. So therefore, you won't be able to drop into the here and now. And as a consequence, you won't be able to drop into flow. Another way to look at it is almost the same as Yerkes-Dodson law, where arousal, which is sort of stress, there's an optimal level of stress. Not enough stress, and you lose attention. Too much stress, impaired by too much anxiety and the wrong chemicals, and you won't be able to drop into flow. So that's the golden rule of flow and the first flow trigger. Now, the second flow trigger is pattern recognition. And this is an important one because I can use this one to explain the dynamics, to explain the dynamics of dropping into flow. And let's talk about this using an example. Let's say you play the game Sudoku, where you have to look at the number and see which number you still have to find. In the beginning, you look at the page and it's not working. You're focused and you feel slightly agitated. That's noradrenaline at work. You focus more and more, and suddenly you see one. And when you see one, boom, you get a small injection of dopamine. Now you have more dopamine in your system. You focus more. You've got noradrenaline in your system. And suddenly you see 2 or 3 more. That's when you drop into flow. When there are enough noradrenaline levels to get you focused and enough dopamine for task accomplishments, that's how you drop into flow, by recognizing the patterns. So that's the second one. And the third flow trigger is intrinsic motivation. When you do something you really enjoy doing, you naturally pay more attention and are able to focus on the task at hand in the present moment. You don't want to distract yourself because you love doing it so much. And the fourth flow trigger is risk. When you do something that's risky, that's dangerous, you have to pay full attention. Take, for example, Alex Honnold, who went up El Capitan free soloing without any ropes. One mistake and he would be dead. So he has to be fully focused on the task at hand in the present moment. So risk forces you to focus, and it forces flow upon you. So if you want to get more flow, align with your flow triggers. But what are the flow triggers that work for you? What activities get you into flow? Unfortunately, there's no homogeneous answer to that, simply because everybody's different. And Stephen often likes to say, biology skills, personality doesn't. And peak performance is about making biology work for you rather than against you. So we all need a personalized approach. And in coaching, I do a personalized approach, look at everybody, where is everybody different, and what works for each individual. And the place to start are usually flow profiles. So what are flow profiles? Flow profiles was something discovered by Stephen Kotler and Jeremy Wheel, and they identified 4 different profiles. You could basically say these are 4 different personality types, and each of them have different way of getting into flow. Different activities are receptive to different flow triggers. So what are these 4? The first one are hard chargers, like Alex Honnold you see here. And you can find them in action and adventure sports and in financial markets. And they're receptive to flow triggers like risk. The second group are deep thinkers. And you can find these in science or writers or cognitive professions. And for them, pattern recognition is an important one. Something is complex, they have to think about it, they have to look for patterns. The third one are flow goers. These are people who do yoga or personal growth retreats, or they dial into peak performance masterclasses. And the fourth profile are crowd pleasers. People do peak performance masterclass presentations, or DJs, or sports. Here you see DJ Sasha, one of my all-time heroes. And these people are very receptive to flow triggers like immediate feedback or risk, but they're more social risk rather than physical risk. So when you know your top 2 flow profiles, you can get sense and idea which activities you could do, and you can get a sense for which flow triggers could work for you. So normally you need in a one-on-one session, we talk through this, or in a group, we also talk through, and we help you guide through what works for you. And one example here is the story of James, or at least I call him James. His real name is different, but he wanted to remain anonymous. But I don't like the sound of anonymous, so I'm going to go with James instead. So James was an equity research he was a sell-side equity research analyst. He was ambitious. He wanted to become a better research analyst, and his real dream was eventually to go to a hedge fund and become a portfolio manager at a hedge fund. So 2 years ago, we sat down together and we discovered his flow profiles. He was a hard charger primary, and his secondary was a deep thinker. And then we looked at, okay, so how can we optimize an environment for him? Well, most of the work as an equity research analyst revolved around deep thinking. So we aligned everything. We built a daily structure for him to maximize flow. And this worked very well. The quality of his work went up. The rankings with clients went up. He got noticed, and eventually he got poached by a prestigious hedge funds who gave him the opportunity to make the step that he always wanted to make. So it can be that simple. Understand your profile, understand your triggers, execute, and the rest take care of itself. So that's on part 2 on the flow triggers and flow profile. So based on that, I would be curious to know what sort of profile do you think you are? If you know, then I'd love to get some inputs in the chat. What do you guys think? Or what flow triggers do you think you're receptive to? And is there anybody who'd like to raise their digital hand to share something or ask a question? Hard charger, of course. I think you're a crowd pleaser, but we'll talk about that. Flow goer. Haha, deep thinker, I think. Also a deep thinker, yeah. Any burning questions, or should we go on to the third pillar? Adrian, crowd pleaser. Yeah, ice hockey is usually crowd pleaser plus hard charger. Can you have more than one? Yes, usually you have two. You have a primary and secondary. And I will, we're going to come back to James, and we're going to see how these dynamic work. So when we talked about our internal state, we said we want to have biology work for us rather than against us. Well, the same is true for our external environment. We want the environment to work for us rather than against us. So we need to manage our environment. And in this pillar, I'm going to talk about two things, about flow blockers and about environmental flow triggers. So to start with flow blockers, what are flow blockers? Well, we talked about flow triggers. These are preconditions that help you drive focus on the task at hand in the present moment. Flow blockers do exactly the other way around. They get you out of flow and they pull you out of the here and now. They pull you out of the task at hand in the here and now. Now, research has identified 8 of them, but here I'm going to discuss 3. And the first one, and obviously the most important one that pulls you out of the here and now, are distractions. And the number one is, of course, your mobile phone. Whenever you're in flow and your phone goes off, you're getting pulled out. When you get a notification on your phone and you hear pling, you're being pulled out. But also pop-ups. So email can be very bad distraction. Your colleagues and also yourself. You're your own worst enemy. So if you want to, let's say, work in flow, a few things that I can suggest is 1, your phone as far away as possible. 2, no pop-ups, no pop-ups for notifications. 3, no pop-ups for email. If you need to have an email, have it on the black screen. And furthermore, also use noise canceling headphones. So you tell your colleagues, fuck off, I'm flowing. And also headphones can have a Pavlovian effect. If you have headphones around your neck and you feel you're dropping into flow, if you put them on, your body knows the Pavlovian effect and you drop into flow easier if it's used to that. So distraction is a very important one. The second one are boredom and anxiety. So if a challenge is too high, you get anxious. Too much stress chemicals prevent from dropping you to flow. If an activity is too easy, you get bored, or if you don't like it, and you're distracting yourself, and therefore you won't be forced to have all your focused attention into the here and now. And the last one, the third one that I'm going to mention here, is limiting beliefs. If you believe that you can't do it, or if you believe that your self-worth or love from others depends on success, you fear the potential consequences and you worry about the then and there. You've got too much stress chemicals in your body, which prevent you from dropping into flow. So your limiting beliefs can be your own worst enemy. So let's go back to James. So he was happy. He went to a hedge fund. He started there late 2022, early 23. He was excited. But when he started, he experienced less flow. And he came to me and during the meeting said, it doesn't work. Now that the environment is different, I can't find any flow. And he was also worried. He feared that he wasn't doing a good job, not making an impression, and he feared that he would get fired. So we started to investigate what was going on. And we found that indeed the environment that he was working in was very different. And that in fact, the environment was working against him rather than for him. And when it came to him, that the flow plan that he had didn't work. Now, two things were very different. The first thing is that he worked in a dealing room kind of environment with a lot of noise, which is very different from the library environment he was used to when he worked in equity research. So this meant way more distractions, especially around market opening. And therefore, it was much harder to concentrate. Furthermore, unconsciously, he hadn't been able to shield himself from the tense atmosphere on the floor. So the floor was different, that was one. And the second thing that was different, that on volatile days, he didn't have time to be a deep thinker. He needed to act, he needed to trade, and he was worried that he would make mistakes and get fired. Now, we went over the situation and we found three things. First of all, he realized that for a different job, he needed a new approach. He needed an approach that was different from the deep thinking approach that he was using. And when we looked at his job, this was much more a hard charger kind of job, and a hard charger approach was required. The good thing is, this was his primary profile. So we needed to make sure that he started to use the environment to work for him rather than against him. So basically, what we had to do is we had to look at the four external flow triggers that hard chargers are receptive to. And these are novelty, volatility, uncertainty, complexity. So the way to look at these are NVUCA. So start with novelty. When there's lots of novel information, lots of new things to go through, there's a lot of data. And a lot of data means a lot of noradrenaline, a lot of things to focus on. And at some point, you need to make sense of it all. You need to see the patterns. And that's when dopamine comes in. And then if you look at VUCA, so volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity, there's lots of information. Share prices are moving up and down. Or on a sports match, let's say when you play field hockey or ice hockey, everybody's running around. You need to make sense of the situation. You need to recognize the pattern and act on that. And that's exactly what hard charters are good at. So for deep thinkers, NVUCA can be difficult because they don't have control over it. But for hard charters, it works very well. So we needed to see how we could leverage that. We discussed that. And the second thing, we needed to make a couple of small changes. So yes, he had to do deep work, but we had to time when to do it and not around market opening hours. And the second thing that he had to do is buy some noise canceling headphones when he wanted to do some deep work. And the third thing is that he needed to reframe his limiting beliefs. He needed to see that he could do it, that he was okay no matter what, and he was gonna be okay no matter what. Now, these things cost us one session to go through, but it changed his year. He was happy then, and he was even happier at the end of the year because he had a stellar performance. And last week he had his compensation discussion, and he was even happier then. And he was very happy that he made the investment into coaching because it was less than 1% of his compensation, so very easily earned back. So that's on flow and the environment. So now that we talked about the three pillars, so the science of flow, how to get into flow, and flow management, let's look at a 5-step flow mastery framework. What are 5 steps to maximize flow? The first one is pick an activity that excites you and maybe has a big impact. 2, align with your flow profile and your flow triggers. 3, create a flow blocker-free environment. 4, make a step-by-step plan, which, by the way, also is a flow trigger. And finally, execute with focus and intention. Now, this is easier said than done. Because in order to master this, you need three things. Three things you need to master. And these three things are actually the prerequisites. The first one is flow. You need to understand flow, both in general terms, as well as what flow is for you. So what is your profile? What are your triggers? And how do you get into flow? The second thing you need, the second prerequisite, is empowerment. You need to empower yourself for flow. In short, you need a strong mindset and empowering beliefs. You need to believe in your capabilities and that you can do it. And you need to believe that you're okay and that you're gonna be okay no matter what. As well as constructive self-talk, what you can say to yourself when things get difficult. And finally, you need alignment. Alignment about what you do in life. Alignment of your ambitions and your goals. Alignment of your body and your mind and of your values. Make sure that what you do is in line with your values, as well as the people you work with, as the people you work for, that your values are aligned. And once these three building blocks are in place, you can follow these 5 steps on a consistent basis, enabling you to find more flow, perform better, and experience higher level of well-being. And again, go back to the beginning. Ask yourself, what would your life and career look like if you'd master flow? What would become possible? And do you want that? And there's a reason why I asked this question. As you could be next. Because I've crafted a special program, a peak performance program, designed to guide those who are truly ambitious and ready to take their career to the next level. It's a 12-week group program with 11 group meetings and 3 one-on-ones. And these programs can train 3 parts: flow, empowerment, and align, i.e. 3 building blocks you need to go through to be able to go to these 5 steps on a consistent basis, i.e. a program that will help you find more flow, perform better, experience life satisfaction. Now, as a New Year's gift, I've got a New Year's gift. So this is basically what the group program looks like: flow, empowerment, and alignment. And as a New Year's gift, I'll offer this program at an absolute fraction of its normal investment. But I must emphasize that there's urgency and scarcity of this opportunity. I'm starting the program in 2 weeks' time. There are 8 slots available and already a few have been taken. So if you're interested in raising your game to the next level and want to explore if and how I can help, then please click on the link that I'm put in the chat in a couple of minutes. But please note that this exploration call is completely free and without any strings attached. If you decide to book a call, I look forward to speak to you then and there. If you don't, then thank you for having participated in this masterclass. And know that if the time comes, you can always send me an email or a LinkedIn message if at some point you need my help or would like a chat. So with that, I'd like to open it for Q&A. And let me first put the link where you can book a discovery call, 30-minute call in the chat. Here's the link. Now let me first go back to the question I would ask earlier. How long can you stay in the flow state? Drawback being too long. Okay. So what's important to know is that flow follows a cycle, a flow cycle. And it usually starts with a struggle. So when you start on a task, let's say you have a big project that you need to work on. in the beginning, it's difficult. It feels, doesn't feel well. Or let's say in sports, you always start with the warming up. And when you have to start to run, it always feels like, oh, I don't really want this. So it always starts with a little bit of struggle. And this is because the first chemical that comes up is noradrenaline. And at some point, dopamine comes to the rescue and you fall into flow. But if you want to maximize flow, you have to understand the cycle, because you always go through the cycle. And as I mentioned earlier, flow is basically an energy exchange. It's an energy optimization. And why does it happen? Because it's costing a lot of energy. The mistake that I made back in 2009 is I stayed in flow for a few hours, which was great. But the next day I was useless because I didn't have enough recovery. And especially so, flow in sports is easier because the body at some point tells you, okay, you need to recover, and you can feel it. But deep thinking flow can be a bit of a double-edged sword, because in 2009 I was useless the next day. So it's important to recover. So let's say you work in an office and you want to do deep work. You can do one in the morning, let's say for 1.5 hours, and take yourself out and do a recovery. And the best is to do an active recovery. Go for a walk, something like that, at least something with movement. Then go back into it again. But go through the whole phase. When you go for a walk and you go back, it always starts with a little bit of struggle. Now, what's important here? Let's say you struggle and you're not getting into flow. You continue to struggle. What's important then is step away. Don't grind through because you continue to stay in struggle, but walk away, take a break. And what you see when you come back, you probably find the answer. So you need to release to get into flow. But recovery is a very important element of flow. If you don't recover, you won't be able to have to maximize flow. If that makes sense. And to some extent, flow is can have bad effects as well. I mean, there are things like gambling and other stuff also are very flow prone. So there are definitely dark sides to flow. So therefore, it's important to channel the flow towards activities that really benefit yourself as well as others. One interesting one, this is especially for people who have kids. Playing video games is very flow prone and very addictive, and some kids can play games for hours. Now, what I used to tell my son is, okay, first do your homework and then you can play a video game. Recently, I changed it and I said, okay, you can play one video game, then you need to do your homework, because what happens then is they drop into flow. They've got all the flow chemicals in their body. They know that, okay, they have to stop after one game, so they do. Because they've been in flow and they start to learn, they learn much better and much faster, and they can concentrate. So there's an interesting ways you can play with flow and learning. But don't let them play for 4 hours, because then they need a recovery rather than homework. So the cycle is important. Any other questions? Feel free to raise your digital hands if you have a question. No more? I also see that that it's 13:33 here or 12:30 in the UK. Thank you again for having participated. If you have any questions, you can book a call, 30-minute call, or you can always drop me a line, send me a chat, send me an email. So thank you very much and enjoy your weekend. Bye.